a civil engineer associated with sort of building London into the world-class city it is today. And then in the number 1 spot was good old Winston Churchill, who of course was British Prime Minister during the 1940s and is perhaps the man most associated with leading the Allied forces to victory in the Second World War. So this should hopefully give you a sort of general idea of the sort of people who tend to wind up on these lists. People who are very famous and accomplished and have done big important things for their country and often the wider world as well. But you can also see how, because the system is ultimately just a popularity contest, there is a possibility that a more, shall we say, questionable choice could slip through as well. So after Britain, the first international knockoff of this show was, I believe, the German edition. And in case your dark mind has already gone there, let me just be clear that the German producers had a very strict no Nazis policy. In fact, the guy that the Germans ultimately voted in as their greatest citizen ever was Konrad Adenauer. He was the first non-Nazi Chancellor of Germany after the Second World War. Today, Chancellor Adenauer is widely considered to have been one of the greatest statesmen of the 20th century, a major figure in helping rehabilitate Germany's international image and re-establish German democracy. Certainly someone I think most people would say is comfortably in the same league as Churchill. Alright, so far, so good. And after the German version came the Indian version. Now obviously, if given the choice, most Indians would just pick their world-renowned independence leader, Mahatma Gandhi, as their top guy. But as far as television goes, that would also be powerfully anticlimactic. So the Indian producers had the good sense to exclude him, and instead of looking for the greatest Indian, their contest became about finding the greatest non-Gandhi Indian. And who, you ask, won that honor? Mother Teresa. She was a Catholic nun who ran various charities for the poorest of the poor in India's urban slums. Mother Teresa was actually born in Yugoslavia, but as a young nun, she immigrated to India at age 18 and lived the rest of her life there. For her charitable work, she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, an honor that Gandhi himself never even got. Mother Teresa died in 1997, and I remember when I was growing up in the 1990s, she was often held up as like the greatest person on earth because of how she had so selflessly devoted herself to serving the most destitute people in the world. And then there was this whole idea that because she was objectively quite ugly, she embodied the old parable about how true beauty is within. Do kids today grow up learning about her? She's been dead now for quite a while, so let me know, Zoomers. Alright, so next up was Australia, who selected as their top guy, Dr. Howard Florey. I alluded to this guy in my recent video about Australian culture, where I talked about how the Australians take credit for having invented penicillin. Now, British people learn that penicillin was discovered by a British doctor named Alexander Fleming in 1928, which is true. But the development of the naturally occurring substance of penicillin, which is a kind of mold juice, into a mass-produced consumer drug, was actually done by an international team of 3 men: Fleming, a German man named Ernst Chain, and the Australian, Dr. Florey. They all shared the 1945 Nobel Prize for Medicine, and Australia gained a national hero. Now, the South Africans ran their TV contest a bit like the Indians. This is because their country also has a guy that pretty much everybody recognizes as unambiguously being their greatest citizen, the civil rights icon turned president, Nelson Mandela. So once again, they decided to just give him the top spot automatically, and instead focus on finding the second greatest South African of all time. But alas, we never ultimately got to find out who that was, because the show was quickly cancelled after the results of that first initial poll were made known. None of the people who made it into the top 9 were all that controversial, but some of the people who made it into the top 90 were pretty shocking. The one who caused the biggest public outrage was the guy who came in 19th place, Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd. Dr. Verwoerd was a notoriously racist white prime minister of South Africa during the 1960s. He's considered to be the architect of the so-called apartheid system of racial segregation that defined that country for a generation. So the idea that someone like him could make it into a top 20 list of greatest citizens threw the entire integrity of the voting system into controversy, and the whole show was canned. And as a result, we will never know who the second greatest South African of all time was. Holland came next, and in 2004, they selected as their greatest ever citizen a man named Pim Fortuyn. He was a politician who had run for prime minister just 2 years earlier. So Pim Fortuyn was this very eccentric and charismatic populist who had made a big splash when he burst onto the Dutch political scene in the early 2000s. To this day, he is still probably one of the most internationally famous politicians that Holland has ever produced. He was a former professor and a kind of across-the-board critic of the entire Dutch political establishment, but he quickly became best known for being an outspoken opponent of Muslim immigration, which had risen to become a very big issue in European politics in the aftermath of 9/11.
It is a backward culture. I have written a complete book about it.
Many Muslims, many foreigners feel outraged by that, feel scared, frightened, and really see you as a very dangerous man.
But you have heard what they are saying about us and about our culture.
But at the same time, Pim Fortuyn was not some stereotypical right-wing nationalist. He had a lot of left-wing views as well, and was openly gay, and this very sort of urbane type of character. So he transcended easy categorization, and that was a big part of his populist appeal. During Holland's 2002 election, Fortuyn was assassinated by a left-wing radical, which provided this very dramatic, traumatizing end to his brief political career. And in a way, this gothic conclusion made him seem even more fascinating and compelling. So it was in this context that the Dutchies elected him as their greatest ever citizen in 2004. But 16 years later, I think a lot of Dutch people would probably say that the choice now feels a little bit dated. The political movement that Pim Fortuyn represented was so idiosyncratic that no one could really take his place. And so as a result, I think it's sort of hard to say what exactly his long-term legacy was. Let me know, Dutchies. All right, but here is one country I actually do know, Canada. We held our version of this TV contest, which was known as the Greatest Canadians in 2004 as well. And the guy we voted in was also a politician, a guy known as Tommy Douglas. Tommy Douglas was the first Democratic Socialist to ever win a provincial election in Canada, and he served as Prime Minister of Saskatchewan from 1944 to 1961. While in power, he introduced a form of government-run health insurance for the Saskatchewaners, which was the first program of its kind in Canada. As a result, today he is often celebrated as the father of Canadian Medicare. I actually remember when this whole TV contest thing was happening in Canada, and the way that a vote for Tommy Douglas was like explicitly framed as a vote of support for the Canadian healthcare system. Polls often show that the Canadian healthcare system is like one of the most beloved national icons of this country. And when Tommy Douglas eventually won, it was forever brought up as just one more example of how much Canadians love Medicare.
What's wrong on this issue with us?
I guess the powers that be don't share our beliefs that healthcare ought to be universal. I mean, Canadians didn't until we met up with a guy named Tommy Douglas, who pretty much changed everyone's mind. In fact, he's just most recently been revered as Canada's singular most important person. We think so much of
I mean, in your history?
In our history.
Of your whole history?
In our whole history.
The history of Canadian Medicare is actually a little bit more complicated than that, but that is a subject for another video. When the French held their contest, they just picked Charles de Gaulle as their greatest guy. Charles de Gaulle was, of course, a famous anti-Nazi resistance leader during the Second World War, who would later go on to serve as president of France for a while in the post-war period. The modern Constitution of France is very much his creation. Bit of a ho-hum pick compared to the previous two, wouldn't you say? All right, and now we are up to the good old USA. The long-forgotten US version of this thing was a show called Greatest Americans. It aired on the Discovery Channel in 2005, hosted by now disgraced sex pervert Matt Lauer. And the winner was Ronald Reagan, the ex-movie star turned conservative president, who is perhaps best known for his hardline anti-communist foreign policies in the 1980s.
Tear down this wall.
So, Americans, do you think that this choice has aged well? Polls generally show that Ronald Reagan is still one of the best-liked presidents of recent years, But 2005 was also probably a somewhat unrepresentative year as far as Reagan nostalgia goes, considering that he only died in 2004. What's quite interesting about the larger American top 10, however, is just how many